In linear perspective, we use lines to create depth. This was a concept that was debated in the Renaissance in a way that now it seems totally obvious. And one of the classic measures of a good idea is that afterwards it's obvious. And once you see perspective done properly, it's really easy to identify early works where you look at it and you think, like, it just doesn't look right. And you might not know how to correct it or what the perspective should be, but it's easy to recognize what isn't right and how it could, how that really affects the illusion of the third dimension. So prior to the Renaissance, we get a lot of work that has indications of perspective. We can see tiles on the floor, you see pieces of furniture in space, and we'll look at an example of one. But it doesn't all come together into one unified system. So how many different points of perspective are there in the world that we would regularly deal with? Count them. What do you got? We've got 6. So there's 1-point perspective, which is looking right down the street. 2-point perspective, where you're looking at a street corner, so you have streets going in either direction. 3-point perspective, where you're looking down on a building, on a corner, so you've got 2 streets and you're looking down. 4-point perspective is where things start to have some curvature, top and bottom, so you have a vanishing point on the top and on the bottom and on the left and the right. 5-point perspective, think about looking at a mirrored ball, so that you have all 4 points and the curvature of field. And then the 6-point perspective is you've got all that, plus you've got what you can see through the sphere. So you've got the reflection on the outside and on the inside. Are you going to use all these? Probably never. You'll use 3 of them, maybe 4. But as you can see, it's a lot more elaborate than just linear perspective as leading lines going back into space. To me, it's just like saying photographers aren't like quick enough to get it. They'll never understand what artists get, and I don't believe it. I think if it's explained to you, you can see it and say, like, okay, that's 3-point perspective, or that's 4-point. Or it's, it's curvilinear and it's got 6 points in it. But you understand it, so that when you look at it, you can see what's really operating there. The other one, which comes up when people start shooting architecture and start correcting for buildings, is called axonometric and isometric drawings. And not that you need to get too into it, you might want to know what it is. And it's when objects are drawn in a 3-dimensional view, but they're designed so that you can actually pull measurements off of them. So they look a little distorted. They look like they're tipped up in the back and they look a little too square. Generally, it's an engineering problem. Photographers not really going to have to worry about it. So let's look at some examples of some early paintings that have the perspective a little off and then how they fix that. The first painting I'd like us to look at is Robert Campin's The Annunciation. And if you've ever taken an art history course, I'm pretty sure you've seen this. It's one of the baselines for introducing how perspectives changed over history. So if we focus on the center panel, just look at what's going on there, you can see some indications of perspective. There's furniture, there's a fireplace, there's a window in the background. 2 figures, they're there in space, but they kind of seem like they're floating a little bit. They don't seem like they're really like sat down in the space. So if we trace the lines of perspective on the bench and we look at it, we can see they all converge at a vanishing point in the back of the scene. The top of the bench, the side of the bench, the bottom of the bench, they all abide by one vanishing point. But the thing is that as we look around other parts of that panel, we'll see that what happens on the fireplace goes to a different vanishing point off to the side. And the table looks like it's tipped up in space. Really, it should be, as the red oval showing it, it should be a little flatter. So Campin is showing us that their artists are observing depth, but they're not really figuring out how it's going to reconcile inside of one space. And this is something that, again, now it's kind of obvious and it just comes across. You can take a picture. Generally, it's going to be okay. You use a 50mm lens, not a tremendous amount of distortion. The scene's going to look sort of like what is in front of you. But this was an evolution. And as it evolved, one of the guys who was at the forefront of it was Piero della Francesca. And if we think about what he's doing, in the 1400s when he's making this work, you have four main debates that are happening. They're coming from theology, philosophy, art, and science. And each group is trying to figure out how we see. And they're trying to come up with a system that explains how it all happens. Now, this is during the same time when the Earth is still considered to be flat. And if you said anything that was in tremendous opposition to what the church was going on, you were going to be deemed a heretic, maybe thrown in prison, burned at the stake, whatever their sort of preference was for disposing of you. So this was a really revolutionary concept. And coming up with perspective and how we see is something that artists actually led the way. One of the things that Della Francesca writes about when he writes about perspective is that he's talking about perspective up to a given point, which means he leaves out the things that are massive, observing things in space, and tiny, observing things in a microscope. So when you see things very close up and very far away, what he was talking about in terms of perspective, the theory didn't fully reconcile itself, but he said, look, I'm interested at like the human scale and what we're dealing with here. He picks about 60 degree of an angle of view, which translates pretty well to photography. So what he laid out actually worked for what photographers were going to do. So if we're in this human scale, his sort of foundations of perspective allowed for scenes all of a sudden to have a unified vision. So when we look at his drawings and paintings of the city, we can see like that looks about right. And again, whether we can explain it or not, it looks correct. And that's the thing that really brought perspective into a new arena, was that it was a unified concept that governed the entire space, so that everything you saw in the painting, everything abided by the same type of perspective. What we can see from Piero della Francesca and what he sort of laid out, he paved the way for other artists. And looking at somebody like Raphael in the School of Athens, we can see that Raphael very quickly took della Francesca's ideas, built on them, and made this painting which sits on the walls of the Vatican. And you can see it's got a central point of perspective that everything in the scene abides by that. All of the architecture, all of it converges at the center of the scene. So this is sort of step one in what you're going to do with perspective. This is one-point perspective. What happened as time moved on was that artists were actually able to manipulate perspective and do things inside of the scene that you might not notice, but that's one of the advantages that the painter has over the photographer, is that they can actually introduce multiple horizons. So generally we think about there being just one singular horizon. If we look at this painting, the Holy Family on the Steps by Poussin, we can see that if we trace the lines of the architecture, we can see that some of them come down and land on the first step. They land just where everybody's feet are. But if we trace the other ones, we see that they land at a different step. He's introduced a second horizon. And if we look closer at some of the architecture in the background, we see that they don't even go to the same vanishing point. But if we go back to the original image, all of this trickery isn't visible. And this is really where artists excel, is that if you do something well enough, it's not realistic or lifelike, it's not truthful, it's all completely manipulated, but it looks correct. And that, once you get a really good handle on it, the way in which perspective operates and how you manipulate it is up to you. And if you do it right, the viewer will never even notice. Let's have a look at some examples in pictures so that we can see what this looks like photographically. So, this is a scene in Japan, single point perspective. You can see the lines of convergence in the background. All of the architecture abides by it. The path, the wall, everything moves back into space. Tremendous amount of depth. It's not a spectacular image, but it illustrates really what single point perspective will do. Now let's take a look at how you can see perspective in a photograph. So, step number one, if you'd like pictures that have greater depth, shoot deeper scenes, just to start, just so you can see it. This is a scene that I photographed in Japan. single point perspective, but you can see where everything converges out in the distance. There's no clear horizon, but linear perspective in one point is controlling the entire scene. So whether it's a scene like this or sort of a tunnel scene where you're looking down a pathway, all of this is going to have a single point of perspective in the center that everything emerges from. And these are the very sort of obvious examples of leading lines. They're good to start with. You'll never stay here. If I look at 1,000 of these pictures, they get really boring really quickly. But it's just a sort of learning step. It's like doing the scales in music. You get it until you can move on, and then you may never do it again. But it's just a good idea that if you're trying to create pictures with greater depth, ask yourself, and you look at the scene, does the scene have depth? How deep physically? How many meters, how many feet is the scene? If the scene's only 5 feet deep, you're going to have to work a lot harder to create depth than if the scene is 50 feet deep. Up next, two-point perspective. So two-point perspective, as we looked at it, we have two vanishing points, one on the left-hand side, one on the right-hand side. And as we look at these buildings in the way that all of the lines move off to the left, and on the other side, all of the lines move off onto the right. So this is the sort of phenomenon where you look at the corner of a building and you see some depth as it moves off in space in both directions. When I take the lines away, you'll be able to see still those lines of perspective inside of it. And as far as I found with almost every student I've ever worked with, once you see the perspective in it, you'll never not see it again. When we get to three-point perspective, we have vanishing points off on the left and on the right, and in this case, also on the bottom. And this is when we get a full three-dimensional view of an object. This is a small lantern in a Zen temple in Japan. So it's a pretty simple one. It's just to illustrate the idea that you have 3 points of perspective, and this is, for the most part, where a lot of photography is going to cut off. You're not often going to get into 4-point perspective unless you're doing like super wide angle work. We'll look at a few examples of that just so that you have a reference of it. But for the most part, the vast majority of what you do is going to exist between 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. The last picture in the linear perspective set that I want to look at is a picture from a project that I've been working on. And this is to show you that just like the lantern, there's 3-point perspective inside of this scene. We can see where the church runs off to the left. We can see the facade goes off to the right. And because we're up above the church looking down on it, the same way we were looking down on the lantern, we can see that there are 3 points of perspective. And it gives us a three-dimensional view of this church. It sets it deep into space so that we get a tremendous amount of depth. And the lines in the foreground, which lead us up to it, this is a combination of what would be leading lines which don't abide by perspective. Those lines aren't really, they're not at the same angle as the church, so it's not a cohesive, looking down the block system, or we think of Della Francesca in the way that his ideal city looked. It's not set up that way. Those lines are going at slightly different angles, but you can unify curves and other lines into linear perspective so that everything goes together, gives you a tremendous amount of depth. And again, whether you're looking at something, a little tiny lantern or a big, huge scene, it's going to allow for you to create a tremendous amount of depth that if you went down and stood in front of the church and took a picture of the facade, it would just look flat and it wouldn't have any depth to it.